Hey, this is John Lee Dumas, the founder and host of Entrepreneurs on Fire. And if you're wanting to learn how to embrace change and navigate through disruption as a leader, then listen to the Leadership is Changing podcast with my good friend, Dennis Giannoutzis. He's prepared to ignite.
Welcome to Leadership is Changing. Each week, we and our guests provide information and insights through exploring leading change. This is taking your leadership to another level by finding the balance between executive excellence and personal well-being through stories that inspire real change. It's time to adapt in our fast-moving world when leadership is changing with your host, Dennis Giannoutzis.
There's always that saying out there, I think it's culture eats strategy alive. I think that's the right way of saying it, or how it's said. What do they mean by that, and what are you seeing out there in the market today?
Yeah, so that's actually a really great question. So if we think about the things that have evolved over the last few years, we know that there are organizations out there that are performing quite well. So in other words, they're delivering on their strategy. So they have very good sales, they have very good revenue, they have very good profitability. And some organizations aren't performing that well or having difficulty attracting talent or retaining talent. And what we're seeing is that more and more, either people inside organizations or people who are exploring joining an organization, it's not just about the job, it's not just about the pay, but more and more people want to join a culture that has some very specific characteristics where they will be more likely to succeed as opposed to a culture that's maybe not as positive or as supportive or as tolerant of errors, as an example of cultures that people may not be attracted to.
Okay, so what I'm hearing here, Alex, is that the culture is really important. So I think it's really important. And so when you say that, Alex, about the culture side of things, I think it's really important because a lot of people do join organizations, but they leave people. And if the culture isn't right, how does an organization, A, know it's not right, and B, how do they fix it?
Two great questions. On the first question, I think, and it's interesting, I was having this conversation just a little while ago, and I was saying there's an organization that I was working with where they have a very innovative culture, right? So their culture is quite good in innovation and developing cutting edge things. And yet, if we looked at, so that was a very positive culture, right? Able to innovate, able to deliver, some very nice product. But then if we looked at the people side of the culture, then the people side of the culture wasn't really following suit. So in fact, there could be parts of a culture that are really positive and then other parts of the culture that need to be worked on. So I think it's really important that leaders in an organization really take a cold, hard look at current state of affairs, because I think sometimes because they're focused so much on one part of the culture that's good and positive and working well, we can easily imagine that, oh, the whole culture is good. And in fact, that's usually not the case. So usually there'll be parts of the culture that will be strong and then other parts of the culture that need to be worked on. If we talk about what can help them do, first of all, is taking a really, really cold, hard look at both the subjective parts of the culture and the objective data. So for example, cultural surveys or cultural diagnostics or engagement scores or things like that can give us a good indication. But I think actually having conversations with people that are in the culture and maybe people who have left the organization as well. So to not be reticent to talk to people who have left the organization and talk about, were there any characteristics of the culture that led them to move on. And I think it's important at that point, once this cold, hard look has been taken, to really then say, okay, how do we help evolve our culture? Because maybe the culture was good for many years, but with everything that's changing in the environment and in the context and in a whole bunch of industries, it's always important to say, how do we continue to evolve our culture so that it's actually going to help us to get where we want to go as opposed to being a hindrance, and that we can attract and retain people so that culture can be that differentiator where people want to join us, not because of what we sell or what we make or what services we provide, but really to be part of a culture that's positive and is allowing people to be themselves. So I want to talk a little bit more about that aspect of cultures now that are becoming more prized.
It's interesting how you talk about the cold, hard look. I think it's the cold, hard look at themselves and they need to look in the mirror. However, Alex, I see sometimes that a lot of organizations tend to put their head in the sand and they want to do a tick in the box type scenario. Oh, yeah, we looked at our culture, but are they willing to do something about it? Because one is to actually get the feedback, two is actually to acknowledge it, but three, which is really important, is to do something about it. Are you seeing a lot of organizations who are paying lip service to it? And are you seeing those who are actually very serious about it and actually doing something about it? And what kind of results are they getting?
I think if organizations are really committed to the first part, right, really taking a cold, hard look at the culture, the current state of the culture, they tend to be more open to the feedback that's generated, right? And to the feedback that's shared. So usually those two will go hand in hand, right? If we're willing to take a cold, hard look, we're more likely then to be open to, to the data of where we are culturally. What tends to be a challenge is how do we make things better or how do we evolve the culture? It's not necessarily about the culture being better. It's about being more adapted to where the organization is. And I think I'll give an example in terms of leadership development. And I think a lot of organizations over the past many years have really said, hey, how do we develop our leaders? How do we develop programs to help them become more strategic thinkers, to help them become better managers, to help them do business planning, to help them drive results, to help them take on accountability? And that's great, right? And that's really great and really important. And they tend to stop there. But culture tends to live or not live. It tends to live in terms of how people interact with each other, right? The interpersonal dynamic that happen inside an organization. So those are things like emotional intelligence, right? Empathy, compassion, vulnerability, being open to diversity, psychological safety, so people can be themselves, are not just allowed to be themselves, are actually supported in being themselves and sharing who they are and sharing their knowledge and sharing their experiences. And along with psychological safety, something we don't talk about a lot, and it's a concept that I've been thinking about very recently, that's psychological security. So we could say, yeah, we're psychologically safe and we want people to be themselves and we want people to talk about who they are. But if something happens where a group or a person or a team is not allowed to do that, do we have a security mechanism, so psychological security, to intervene and do something when the safety isn't there? So in other words, can somebody raise the flag and say, hey, thought this was a psychologically safe culture. I actually don't feel comfortable in either sharing something I'm seeing or not allowed to be myself. And then do we have a mechanism for security, for intervention to do something to bring things back? That's where many organizational cultures tend to not go to that interpersonal dynamic, tend not to create a holistic, psychologically safe environment. And if the safety in the environment is not upheld, there's no security mechanism to intervene. So that's something more and more that people inside organizations and people outside that are thinking about joining the organization are very attuned to.
Nice. And for a lot of our listeners, they'll be picking up that you've got a Kiwi accent, but you're actually based in Spain at the moment, which is wonderful. And so do you travel a lot? Do you?
Yes, I've been a perpetual traveller for about 13 years. I spent 8 years living on a yacht around Europe. And the last few months, we've swapped that for a motorhome. So we're traveling around Europe on a motorhome.
That's great. So that would have been a little bit of a different sort of kind of lifestyle. And are you one of these people, what we call a digital nomad?
Yeah, I guess you'd call it that. Yeah.
Yeah. And
perpetual seeker.
Yeah. And before you left, say, New Zealand to go traveling, or what else have you done in your life? In other words, tell us a little bit more about your background. Of course, I've given the listeners a little bit of an introduction to you, but tell us more about you and what you've done.
Okay. I've always been in business for myself. I suppose you'd call me a serial entrepreneur. I've had 18 different businesses in my life of varying sizes and teams, from just me to teams of salespeople and so on. And along the way, I've always been very consumed and interested in trying to answer the question, how do you get the most out of life? How do you really achieve success? How do you live a life where you're feeling that you're living to your highest potential? So alongside running businesses and developing those, I was always a student of success, studying personal development and spirituality and business courses and things like that too. And that's really the basis of my work now, is helping people to understand really how to achieve that success. And it actually, I had a bit of a life-changing event in my mid-40s when I went from being a multi-millionaire and successful businessman to becoming homeless, losing everything. And that really pivoted me into a different direction and taught me a lot of things about how we do create true success in our life. And that also involves how we become a true leader, if that's our role and vocation.
Liam, when I work with leaders around the world, there is some of them who are bored in their jobs. They feel like they're achieving something and they're doing really well, but they're not actually fulfilled in life. And so one thing is that when we talk, they're actually wanting to go off and do a business or go and do something else outside of where they are working today. And they have this fear of actually making a decision and taking the leap and going and doing it. Now, for a lot of them, the fear is failure, or the fear is, I might do okay, but I might lose everything. For you, when you went from that multimillionaire scenario of actually being homeless, what was it like for you to go from that scenario to the homeless side? And then what did you do to come out of it?
The funny thing is, you mentioned something really key, which is fear. And I think most people, their lives are driven by subconscious fears. And when I became homeless, I realized that my entire life I had been driven subconsciously by two fundamental fears. One was the fear of not having enough, of losing what I had and not having enough. And that was what drove me to continually put pressure on myself, set higher goals, always try to achieve more, and really create a lot of stress and problems in my life as along the way, as well as creating some success. And the other fear that many people have, and that was driving me as well, was the fear of not being loved. But ironically, when I lost everything, I had to face and experience both of those fears, the fear of not having anything and the fear of not being loved. Because there I was sleeping on my mother's couch. I had to move into her small apartment and sleep on the couch in the living room. And I had the two things that I'd realized I'd been afraid of all my life, not having enough or not having anything and not being loved, they were there. I was faced with those as a reality. But something really interesting happened, and this was what made the shift. And I didn't really realize it at the time, but my work since has been about researching and then helping other people to understand this as well, which is when you actually make a shift or when you experience the things that you're afraid of, your brain does something very interesting. And it moves from having a fear of something to releasing that fear when you actually experience it. And when you release your fears, you actually activate a different part of your brain. This is actually science-based, what I have discovered and what I'm teaching. And so when I pivoted from being homeless to rebuilding my life, it was through using a different part of my brain. And that part of the brain only becomes activated when you don't have fear. And that's the key to it, really. And I think in terms of leadership, and as you say, people, they're afraid of doing something different. They're afraid of maybe going after something that they think they might really enjoy, or they're afraid of getting unstuck from where they are and taking a risk, if you like. And it's not really their fault that their fear is keeping them stuck. But what actually happens on a biological level is that when you're afraid, even if it's a subconscious fear, you're using a different part of your brain, a part of your brain that will keep you stuck. So you have to learn how to release those fears so that when you do, you activate another part of your brain, which is the part that will move you forward, that is in fact responsible for all achievement and all moving forward, if you like, and all fulfillment in life. It only comes when you actually use another part of your brain.
That is fascinating. I love what you're sharing there. I think that's really cool. And I think the listeners you will be getting a lot out of this already from Liam, listeners, because some great things he's sharing there. And Liam, this whole topic around the brain, the way we work, the way we think, the way we do things in life is fascinating. It really is. And Liam, I know that you've got a podcast as well. It's called Let Yourself Off the Hook. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
Let yourself off the hook.
Yeah. And also you're a best-selling author and the creator of Brain Rebalancing. Tell us a little bit more about that.
What I've created is a model of how the brain actually works. And it's a science-based model, although I don't use scientific terms because I make it in a way that's much easier to understand. But essentially what it says is, what my model has shown, is that you have 4 parts to your brain. And if you're not using these 4 parts of your brain correctly, you're going to have problems show up in your life. Because the thing is, the brain, in its essence, is nothing more than a machine. It's a biological machine, and it has a biological function. And the function of the brain is to ensure that you, as the owner of the brain, or every organism that has a brain, it's to ensure that organism has the best chance for survival. All of nature is wired to survive as the primary purpose of all life. The primary function of all life is to seek to survive. And the way things best survive is by being the best that they can be. So literally, we have this machine which is designed to make us and every living thing the best that we can be so that we have the greatest chance for survival. And for humans, being the best that you can be doesn't just mean physically, it also means mentally and emotionally. So when you really think that one through, you realize that we have a biological purpose to be happy, to be fulfilled, to get the most out of life. And we're not biologically designed to have stress and problems, because stress and problems do not help us survive biologically. They weaken us physically and mentally and in many different ways. And so they actually get in the way. And if you think about this idea that your brain is a machine, what does a machine do? It's designed for one very specific purpose. And if you use it the right way, it will get the outcome that it's designed to get. But if you use it the wrong way, you end up with problems. For instance, a motor car, if you know how to drive it and you drive it the right way, it gets you to where you want to go, which is its purpose, easily, enjoyably, and predictably. But if you start messing around with it and doing the wrong things, putting the wrong fuel in, keeping the handbrake on and the accelerator at the same time or whatever, you're going to have a rough ride and you're going to end up with problems. And the brain is exactly the same. So my 4-part model, what that really teaches people is firstly to understand what the 4 parts of your brain actually are and how they're designed to be used. And most importantly, the one of those 4 parts, or really how all those parts all interact with each other, but how one of the 4 parts is specifically designed to be the master of your life and to guide you down the fastest and easiest path to you being the best that you can be. That's what it's there biologically to do. And we all end up with problems and stress because we don't know, firstly, that this part even exists, and secondly, we don't know how to use it the right way. And what I found when I rebuilt my life after being homeless was I switched into using this part of my brain, not knowing what it was, and things worked out a lot better for me in my life. Things happened a lot more smoothly. All the things that we might call coincidence or luck or synchronicity, instead of me trying to force success and chase after success, it was like success was coming after me, and all sorts of unexpected things were happening and good things were happening and things were flowing on a lot better without the stress and problems. So brain rebalancing is about understanding how to move your brain to be using it the right way rather than the wrong way. And when you use it the right way, it's remarkable how your problems seem to just fade away. And you find yourself doing that thing that we're all after, which is really feeling, yes, I am in control of my life. I am being the best that I can be. I am doing what I'm supposed to be doing, and I'm actually fulfilled and happy, and I'm not dealing with stress and problems all the time instead.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Leadership is Changing with your host, Dennis Giannoutsas. Each week, we and our guests provide information and insights through exploring leading change, inspiring executives and leaders to adapt and lead a bigger game in a fast-moving world.